In the 13th century, the Republic of Venice was one of the leading merchant empires in Europe. The merchants from Venice traveled far and wide in pursuit of profit. But a few of them traveled very far. A small group of men from the same family made the extremely long and dangerous voyage to China during the reign of the Mongol Empire. The result was a more detailed description of China than had ever been known before in the West. Learn more about the journeys of Marco Polo on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Chubbies. Now that summer is here, your shorts shouldn't hold you back, and Chubbies gets that. Their lined swim collection is built for comfort, with chafe-free liners, four-way stretch, and bold prints that are actually fun to wear. If you're someone who enjoys summers, and I know living in Wisconsin I do, Chubbies makes some of the most comfortable, flexible shorts out there. Their original stretch shorts come in a range of inseam lengths depending on how much leg you want to show. I went with the 7-inch, and the fabric is made for movement without sacrificing style. If you're heading to the pool or beach, their classic lined swim trunks are a favorite. They're lightweight, quick drying, and come in tons of fun designs: palm trees, flamingos, or even solid colors. Chubbies also has a solid lineup of performance polos, soft, breathable, and ready for anything from lounging at home to heading out for the day. For a limited time, Chubbies is giving my listeners 20% off your order with code DAILY at chubbyshorts.com. That's code DAILY at chubbyshorts.com. Show your support and tell them that I sent you. Don't blend in with the crowd. Stand out with Chubbies. This episode is sponsored by Planet Money. Tariffs, meme coins, Girl Scout cookies, what do they all have in common? Money. Economics is everywhere and everything fueling our lives, even when we least expect it. If you're a fan of Everything Everywhere Daily and are curious to learn something new and exciting about economics every week, I recommend you listen to the Planet Money podcast from NPR. What I like about Planet Money is that I can get updates on the week's financial news in about 30 minutes. Stories like the Federal Reserve changing interest rates or the impact of trade policy. From the job market to the stock market to prices at the supermarket, Planet Money is here to help explain it all. The Planet Money hosts go to great lengths to help explain the economy. They've done things like shot a satellite into space, started a record label, made a comic book, and shorted the entire stock market. All to help you better understand the world around you. Tune in to Planet Money every week for entertaining stories and insights about how money shapes our world. Stories that can't be found anywhere else. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. A common theme I've had in many of the episodes of this podcast is contact and clashes between different civilizations. I've done episodes on the travels of the great Islamic traveler Ibn Battuta, the connections between Rome and China, and the voyages of the great Chinese admiral Zheng He. Before Ibn Battuta's travels in the 14th century and Zheng He's voyages in the 15th century, a small group of men from the city of Venice made an incredibly lengthy overland journey through Central Asia to China. Most of you are probably familiar with at least the name Marco Polo, if not his travels. And if nothing else, you probably know the name from the game that's often played in a swimming pool. Marco Polo was born around 1254 in Venice during the High Middle Ages. To understand why his story matters so much, you need to picture Venice at this time. It wasn't just another Italian city. It was a maritime empire, a bustling hub where East met West. Venetian merchants were the master traders of the Mediterranean, and the Polo family was right in the thick of this commercial world. Marco's father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo were already seasoned merchants who had previously made journeys to the Far East. So Marco wasn't some random adventurer who decided to explore the world. He came from a family that understood international trade, spoke multiple languages, and had already established connections far beyond Europe. Both Niccolo and Maffeo had ventured as far as the court of Kublai Khan in the Mongol Empire, and a trip of such length was almost unheard of at this time. In a previous episode, I discussed what ancient China and Rome knew about each other, and the answer is it wasn't very much. But by the 13th century, things had improved, if only because the Mongols had expanded so far into the Near East and Eastern Europe, but there still wasn't any regular contact between China and Europe. So the journeys made by the Polo brothers was still extremely rare at this period. Their first journey to China began in the year 1260 when Marco was only 6 years old, and they returned in 2069, 9 years later, when Marco was 15. During their first trip, they were invited by an envoy of Kublai Khan to visit his summer palace in Chengdu, or as it's better known in the West, Xanadu. When they returned to Venice, Niccolo was able to meet and get to know his son, whom he hadn't seen since he was a child. We don't have the details of what happened when he came home, but he almost certainly regaled his son with his tales of his adventures in China. Soon after the Polos returned home, they began planning a return trip to China. This time, Niccolo was going to bring his young son with him. In 1271, the Polo family departed Venice. The route they took followed what we now call the Silk Road, though people at the time simply called it the Road to Cathay. Starting from Venice, they traveled through the Middle East, across Persia, or modern-day Iran, and through the mountains of Afghanistan and into Central Asia. This was not a quick trip. The journey just to reach China took them about 3.5 years. So why did it take them so long? Well, first, they weren't walking or riding horses in a straight line. They had to join merchant caravans for safety, wait for favorable weather and political conditions, and often stop for extended periods to conduct business along the way. And the Silk Road wasn't really a single road, but a network of trading routes, and successful merchants like the Polos made money at various stops along their journey. And this should also give a clue as to why there was so little contact between Europe and China. Just getting there took 3.5 years, which means at a minimum, a round trip would take 7 years, and that doesn't even include doing anything once you get to China. They eventually reached the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor and grandson of Genghis Khan, who ruled over the Yuan dynasty in China. Kublai Khan welcomed the Polos warmly, especially Marco, who displayed linguistic skill, charm, and curiosity, which resulted in Marco entering the Khan's service. We don't know exactly which languages Marco Polo spoke, but in addition to his dialect of Italian and Latin, he probably knew Persian, Mongolian, a more older form of Mandarin, and probably one or more Turkic languages from Central Asia. And this is what makes Marco's story so unique. Instead of just conducting their business and leaving, the Polos became trusted members of Kublai Khan's administration. Marco, with his gift for languages and his European perspective, became particularly valuable to the Khan. You can kind of think of him as an early cultural ambassador. He could provide insights about European customs, trade practices, and political systems that fascinated the Mongol ruler. For the next 17 years, Marco served in various official capacities. He traveled through the empire on diplomatic missions, essentially becoming the Khan's eyes and ears in distant provinces. This gave him an unprecedented opportunity to observe Chinese civilization, Mongol administration, and all the cultures within the empire. He may have also possibly reached places as far away as Burma and India. Marco was witness to technologies that wouldn't arrive in Europe for decades, if not centuries. He saw paper money being used routinely, something virtually unknown in Europe, where people still relied on gold and silver coins. He observed the Chinese using coal for fuel, while Europeans were still primarily burning wood. He witnessed the efficiency of the Chinese postal system with its network of relay stations that allowed messages to travel across vast distances faster than anything in Europe. The cities he visited dwarfed anything in the West. Khanbalik, the modern Beijing, and Quince, modern Hangzhou, were metropolises with populations exceeding 1 million people, whereas the largest European cities in the Middle Ages had populations of around 100,000. Eventually, after many, many years in China, the Polos decided it was time to go home. Initially, their request to leave the court of Kublai Khan was denied. However, they became concerned about their safety, because if the Khan should die, they could become potential targets of the Khan's enemies once his protection was removed. By 1292, the Polos finally received permission to depart. They had accumulated considerable wealth, and Kublai Khan was aging. Their departure was facilitated by their agreement to escort a Mongol princess to Persia for a diplomatic marriage. This mission took them on a sea route through Southeast Asia in the Indian Ocean. When they finally reached Venice in 1295, they had been gone for 24 years. According to legend, their own family didn't even recognize them. But this is where Marco's story takes an unexpected turn that led to his lasting fame. While the stories of Marco Polo in China are what made him famous, his return to Venice was not the end of the story. In fact, if it just ended there, we might never have known about his travels in China. In 1298, Venice went to war with its rival city-state, Genoa. Marco, now a wealthy merchant, commanded a Venetian galley in the conflict. He was captured by the Genoese and imprisoned. It was during this imprisonment that he met Rustichello of Pisa, a writer of romance literature. This prison meeting changed history. Rustichello recognized that Marco's stories were extraordinary, and together they collaborated on a book that would become known as The Travels of Marco Polo in English or Il Milione in Italian. The process was a collaborative one. Marco provided the experiences and memories, while Rustichello shaped them into a narrative that would appeal to medieval readers. The book was revolutionary for several reasons. First, it provided Europeans with the most detailed and accurate description of China to date. Second, it was written in French rather than Latin, making it accessible to a broader audience of merchants and educated laypeople. Most books written at this time were in Latin. And third, it combined practical information about trade routes and commercial opportunities with vivid descriptions of foreign customs and marvels. When the book began circulating in the early 14th century, reactions were mixed. Some readers were fascinated by Marco's description of Asian wealth and sophistication. But other people dismissed his accounts as fantasy. The stories seemed too incredible to believe. Critics nicknamed the book Il Milione, or the Million, to mock what they saw as Marco's tendency to exaggerate everything by a factor of millions. This skepticism is important to understand. Medieval Europeans had a very limited worldview, and Marco's descriptions challenged fundamental assumptions about European superiority and the nature of the world beyond Christendom. The idea that there were cities larger and more sophisticated than Paris or Venice was difficult for many people to accept. There were other reasons for skepticism as well. Marco's accounts often blended accurate observations with mythic or exaggerated elements, such as stories of unicorns. Some of his accounts of China's wealth and size were over the top. We don't know how much of the exaggeration was Marco's and how much of it was Rustichello's, who actually wrote it. Although there's no Chinese record of his presence, the detailed descriptions he provided suggest access to official documents and first-hand knowledge. He couldn't possibly have known most of the things he reported if he hadn't witnessed it firsthand. Despite initial skepticism, Marco Polo's book gradually gained credibility and influence. By the 15th century, it had become one of the most important geographical texts in Europe. And this actually had an impact on world history, because the book inspired later explorers, most famously Christopher Columbus, who carried a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's travels on his voyages. Columbus was explicitly looking for the wealthy Asian lands that Marco Polo had described. So in a very real sense, Marco Polo's book helped motivate the age of exploration that would eventually connect the entire world. The detailed description of Asian trade goods and commercial practices also influenced European merchants and eventually helped drive the expansion of global trade networks. Venice's dominant position in east-west trade was partially built on the intelligence that the Polos brought back from their journeys. Contemporary historians continue to debate various aspects of Marco Polo's story. Some scholars questioned whether he actually made it to China at all, pointing out that certain details are missing from his account that they believe he should have noticed. Others argue that the collaborative nature of his book with Rustichello means we can't always distinguish between Marco's actual experiences and literary embellishments. However, the majority of serious historians accept that Marco Polo did indeed travel to China and served in Kublai Khan's administration. The level of accurate detail about Chinese customs, geography, and administration in his book would have been impossible to fabricate based on secondhand sources alone. Marco Polo died in Venice in 1324, around the age of 70. By then, he had lived to see his book gain widespread circulation and influence. He had transformed from a young merchant son into one of history's most famous travelers. Despite the fact that there were exaggerations and some outright fabrications in Marco Polo's book, there's no denying the impact that it had. Marco Polo represents the beginning of sustained cultural contact between Europe and East Asia. While there had been earlier contacts, and it would take centuries for things to really get going, Marco's detailed observations and the wide circulation of his book marked a turning point in Europe's awareness of Asia. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. Today's review comes from listener APOS2011 over on Apple Podcasts in the United States. They write, "Recently, my family has bought a house a few states away, and the drive is about an hour and a half long. During that time, we usually put on these podcasts. I love listening to them and learning about new ideas and subjects. Also, I feel these are not too long for people like me with ADHD. Anyways, thank you a lot for being entertaining and extremely interesting." Well, thank you, APOS. I hope you enjoy your new home, and I'm glad to be able to keep you and your family company during the drives. Remember, if you leave a review or send me a boostagram, you too can have it read on the show.